I am Optimus Prime, and I send this message to any surviving Autobots taking refuge among the stars. We are here. We are waiting.
Welcome to the channel. Today I'm going to be talking about using automotive processes and paints on your 3D prints. And I figured if you're going to be talking about automotive paint, there isn't a better model you could use than Optimus Prime. The steps involved aren't really that difficult. It just takes a lot of time and effort, and it's mostly sanding. Way back, before 3D printing was commonly available, I used to do a lot of work on cars, everything from rebuilding engines to bodywork, so this isn't the first time I've used automotive paint. I'm going to walk through all the stages of the process to get your print super smooth before you paint to get that glossy finish. Really, the actual painting part isn't that complicated. It's all the prep work beforehand. Every step in the process is only as good as the one before it. So putting the time in for each stage really determines what the end product's going to look like. Before I start, I want to mention the proper protection you should wear before using paints like this. Whenever I do a video that involves resin, I get a flood of comments about having to wear masks and gloves like I'm working with uranium. Generally, I don't talk about PPE because based on my analytics, everybody that watches my videos are grown adults and you can all figure out what you want to do on your own. I don't need to tell you. But in this case, I'll make an exception because automotive products are a little different. The solvents and chemicals in the paints are no joke and they're pretty aggressive. When I cracked the paint can for the first time and the waft of chemicals hit me in the face, I did have a flashback and nostalgia back to when I worked on cars, but I also probably lost a few brain cells in the process. So if you're gonna try anything like this, you really want to work in a proper space and wear a mask that's rated for these type of chemicals. I'll leave a link in the description for what I got off of Amazon, but there's lots of options you can find locally or elsewhere. If you're watching this and paint cars professionally or have a lot of experience with it, let me know in the comments anything that I may have missed, any tips and tricks or things I could have done different. I don't have a huge experience painting with metallic paints, and I know it's a bit of an art to get the flakes to land properly to get the optimal result. So if you have any ideas or suggestions, leave them below. Now with that all out of the way, let's get to the build. The file I'm using is from Toymaker 3D. It's just a head from the complete body that I scaled up and made some modifications to. The head and antennas were then printed on my Neptune 4 Max that has a 0.8mm nozzle installed. The files were printed at a 0.6 layer height. The face was printed on my Ender3 V3 at a 0.2 layer height. All the prints turned out pretty nice. One side effect of using such a big nozzle is you get some aggressive stair stepping on sloped areas, but nothing some sand you can't fix. Due to scaling up the mesh so much, the tolerance for where the antennas connect got a little loose, so I needed to print these little adapters to take up the slack. The paint I'm using consists of a base coat and a clear coat that I picked up at my local auto body supply store. The clear coat is a 2K gloss top coat. It's a two-part urethane that in this case mixes inside the can when you press the button on the bottom that punctures the inner container, causing the harder in the clear coat to mix. It's basically epoxy and one of the hardest and glossiest clear coats you can apply. For the base coat I just picked a dark metallic blue, which happened to be a Ford color, specifically bright Atlantic blue. The shop mixed and reduced the paint for me, so it was ready to spray. The first step is sanding down those stair steps. Since they're so aggressive, I'm going to use my orbital sander with 80 grit paper. You need to be careful when using a power sander and make sure you keep moving it around. If you stay in one spot for too long, you can build up enough heat to start melting the plastic. Sanding removed the majority of the stepping, so now we can move on to the next step, which is coating the prints in resin. For this process, I add baby powder to the resin in order to thicken it. This allows it to fill the gaps in the prints easier with less coats. I made other videos with this process. If you're interested, I'll leave links in the description to them. The resin I'm using is nothing special, it's just standard UV resin that you would use in a 3D printer. I don't have a specific ratio for how much powder to resin I'm adding. I just keep adding powder until I get a thickness of like a really thick paint. Now it's just a matter of coating the prints. You want to add enough to fill in the print lines, but the thicker you make the layer, the more you're going to need to sand off later, so it's a bit of a balance. Here's what 2 coats of resin look like. The first coat filled in the majority of the voids, and then the second coat just finished it off. After curing, there's still a bit of a residue left over, so I wipe down the prints with isopropyl alcohol to remove that before sanding. To remove the resin quickly, I'll be using 80 grit sandpaper. Now I can move on to the rest of the antenna. The layer lines aren't nearly as bad for the rest of the print, so I can get away with just 1 coat of resin. I'm using a heat gun here before curing to push the resin around and try to smooth it out to avoid any high spots. You can't do this everywhere, but because this part is perfectly flat, it works. And here's the end result after sanding and cleaning the prints. You can see all the areas with the resin are completely smooth and you can't feel any more of the layer lines. Now the face gets the same treatment. This print is already pretty smooth and it'll be getting a matte finish, so it doesn't need to have a ultra smooth coating. So 1 thin coat of resin should be enough to fill in all the lines. Now for the head. It's the same process, just going over it 1 area at a time, adding resin and curing. This will mostly take only 1 coat with touch-ups on a few spots. And here's the results after sanding. You can still see there's some high and low spots, but it's good enough to move on to the next stage, which is filler primer. This primer is thicker than normal primer, and it's meant to fill in small imperfections. After 1 coat, everything is looking pretty smooth, but still needs to be sanded. For this, I move up to 120 grit sandpaper. All the parts get sanded evenly. The intent is to remove the paint from the high spots and leaving it in the low areas. Here's what the prints look like after sanding. You can see the areas that were smooth have almost no paint on them, but all the low areas have paint left behind. Everything gets another coat of filler primer, and then once that's dry, it gets a dusting with a black primer. The black primer isn't intended to completely cover the prints, it's just meant to create a speckling pattern over everything. Once dry, everything gets sanded again with 220 grit sandpaper. The point of the black paint was to show any remaining low spots in the prints. Now that these can be identified, we can move to the next stage, which is spot putty. I like thinning the spot putty down with acetone to make it a little easier to apply. My tube is also super old, so it needs a little extra as it's dried out over the years. I'll end up mixing it till it's a consistency of about peanut butter. Now it's just a matter of brushing it over the areas that are marked with the black paint. Again, you want to apply enough to fill in the area, but not so much that you're going to be sanding forever. I'll tend to put it on a little thick because you have to wait for this to dry, and if you need to apply a second coat, it means more waiting. Once dry, all the spots get sanded down with 220 grit paper. And here's what it looks like after sanding. Everything gets a last coat of filler primer, and it's looking pretty smooth, but we're not done with the sanding yet. Now we move on to the next stage, which is wet sanding with 400 grit paper. You don't need a lot of water to do this, just enough to keep the paper wet. In this step, you're not trying to remove any of the paint, you're just trying to smooth it out and remove any flaws like specks of dust. Once finished, everything gets washed to remove any residue. Finally, sanding's done and it's time for paint. But first, everything needs to get wiped down with alcohol to remove any remaining dirt, fingerprints, or oils that can mess up the paint finish. Here's my air compressor. It's nothing special, but it's been working fine. I have noticed though on bigger jobs that the pressure will drop under a continuous spray. So I added a reserve tank to try to smooth out the pressure changes. The tank is just an old disposable propane tank. I know the hose should be connecting before the water trap, but the fittings were an odd size and I couldn't find the proper adapters. I put a 0.5mm nozzle in my airbrush, as this paint's a bit thicker than normal and it has the metallic flex. So I'm doing a few test prints here just to see how the paint goes down and have something to test the clear coat on later. One potential issue was getting even coverage because the airbrush spray pattern is so small. Ideally I'd have one with a fan tip that would provide a wider coverage, but I applied multiple passes in different directions and that seemed to work. If there's any airbrush companies out there that have an airbrusher compressor better suited to a job like this, feel free to DM me. Before starting on the head, I changed to a bigger paint reservoir, that way I wouldn't need to stop and refill partway through. After giving the first coat about 15 minutes to dry, I applied a second coat. The head was a bit big for my paint booth inside, so I moved outside to spray the clear coat. Now I have my fine dust collector running to try to minimize any dust in the air, and I have a little tent to try to stop anything from settling on it. The instructions on the clear coat say to shake for 2 minutes, then press the button on the bottom, and then shake for another 2 minutes. After that, you have about 48 hours to use it. I'm using my paint shaker I made for my drill. If you have a laser and want to cut your own out, I'll leave the link to the files in the description. Now I'm using the cups I painted before to see how the clear coat goes down, and also to make sure there's no weird reaction with the paint. With the test done, everything gets 2 coats of clear, waiting 20 minutes between the first and second to let it dry. With the clear coat done, I move on to painting the face and the grills metallic silver using acrylic ink. I had ended up reprinting the grills out of resin because it was just easier to do that than go through the process of trying to smooth them out. I wanted to light up his eyes with some LEDs, but I needed some lenses to diffuse them, so I started by cutting them out of some acrylic. Then to make them look frosted, I just sanded them with 400 grit sandpaper. For the lights, I had some programmable LEDs from a project I never finished, so I just took a few of them to wire up. I have some future ideas to add some other electronics to the head, but for now I'll just drive the LEDs with a Arduino Nano. Now it's time to start gluing all the pieces together. The face, I just wedged some cardboard to hold it into place because I need to remove it later. I almost forgot I needed a stand to put the head on, so I quickly designed something and cut it out of 1/4 inch plywood. And here are some final beauty shots. Well, that's everything you need to know, more or less. If you made it this far, you're amazing. Let me know in the comments what you thought of the process, and if you have any other ideas of things I could try painting, start your comment with the word prime so I know you got this far. Like I mentioned at the start, the process isn't overly complicated. It's just about taking your time and going through all the sanding steps to make sure you get that perfectly smooth finish. Even the smallest defect will show up in these glossy finishes when the light hits it. There are some small defects that don't really show up on camera. There's a few specks of dust that got into the clear coat. Some of the coverage of the clear coat wasn't the best, but what's really good about this is if I really wanted to, I could go back and sand it down with 1,000, 2,000 grit sandpaper and wet sand it to get those imperfections out, and then I can buff that back out to the same shine. Whenever I do these videos with resin, someone always comments about what if there's fine details in the print and won't they get covered? Yes, so don't do that. For options like that, you'll want to separate those detailed sections out, kind of like the grills, and then attach them on after the fact. If you want to know more about the idea of using baby powder and resin to coat the prints, I've done a couple of videos on this that go into more detail, and I'll leave them linked at the end. I have some more plans in the future to add some more electronics to this print to give him a voice, so if that's something you're interested in, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching.